Well, now that you've got the basics of Enscape rendering under your belt, let's talk a little bit about some more advanced features, and then we'll talk about printing big. So first of all, when you are trying to get your rendering to be more photorealistic, there are a couple of things that you can do in Revit to help yourself out. First of all, those of you who are working on laptops, you may start to experience some slowdown on your computer because you have Enscape running and it's chewing up all of your graphics memory. So you can optimize the speed of your computer by not using realistic view in Revit. I have found that makes a tiny bit of difference, but if you have like 10 views open in Revit and they're all on realistic view, then actually you might actually start to notice some performance differences. Also, if you are on the desktops, not on your laptop, and you're using some of the ArchVision content, it will be replaced with essentially this very similar photorealistic content from the asset library in Enscape. Enscape, I believe, just kind of picks its favorite ones and, of course, use the Enscape asset library directly if you want specific people or specific people at specific angles in your rendering. Now, other than that, you should use your normal lighting design process, which is to say, display the light source particularly on your reflected ceiling plan, but also in section drawings. And this way you can aim the lights onto objects. And I find that the biggest difference between a flat rendering and a rendering that has kind of more three-dimensionality to it and frankly just more realism is this uneven lighting. Objects that you want to highlight get literally highlighted by adding additional lights onto them. Now, sometimes you're in a rush and you don't have time to put in the correct kind of either recessed lighting or track lighting. Track lighting in particular is a huge pain to aim in Revit. So you can use some studio spotlights that I created that I'll show you in a minute, and they are aimable and they have a narrow cone of vision. Those allow you to highlight objects without actually having a whole lot of lighting equipment in your model. First of all, if you tap H, you will see the menu pop up. It actually is already up usually when you call up Enscape. Tapping H makes it go away. And normally you are in fly mode, which means you can fly through the world. You can fly through walls and doors and floors. If you tap the space bar, it will place you on what it thinks the ground is. I don't know why, but I seem to have an issue with the ground. So using the keyboard shortcuts here to get you up off the ground when you're in fly mode. Also, when you click and drag with your left mouse button, that is kind of like the look around tool, whereas if you click and drag with the right mouse button, that's kind of like the orbit tool. Scrolling does indeed make you go in and out, but I do find that the keyboard shortcuts do work a little, I don't know, more smoothly. It does seem like that's how the program is set up. Now, other quickie things that we talked about, I think last time, is you can hold down the Shift key, and if you can hear it, I hit it really hard there, and drag the right mouse button. You can kind of change the time of day, which is nice for, obviously, shadows. One thing in the Revit menu, you can control your sun settings here, and Enscape will respect whatever settings you have. So if you go still from Boston, I don't know, at the summer solstice, then hit apply, it will change the view to have that time. You can still change the time of day, and you notice how the lighting now is actually geographically correct. What it's changing is its altitude and its azimuth, more natural. So here I'm going to give myself a little sunset view here. One of the things that are really nice to use is the asset library here in Enscape. I'll just click on the asset library. This is a feature which actually they just came out with. For example, if you use their people, and you may not like their people, I like their people. They're nice. They're all like Euro stylish. You can place them in the model, and I'll just hit escape to stop placing them. You can see that they're in the space, and of course they are three-dimensional, so you can rotate them and have them look at whatever you want. So they're kind of like the RPC people. In fact, what you will find is that the RPC people will get replaced if you have them in there, if you have the ArchVision RPC people. Now, other fun assets include plants, which work pretty well. Let's go to Enscape, Asset Library, and we'll take a look at some vegetation. And here we go, a thinned out bush. We'll just place it. They do look a little funny in your Revit view. And there you go. And these are, again, nice when you have a lot of foliage. This is a three-dimensional foliage, and it will have realistic shadows. So speaking of shadows, as I mentioned, I think that it's really important to have some depth to your lighting. And I have created a number of families here, which are our favorite studio lights. And the advantage of these studio lights is the advantage of all studio lights, which is you don't have to worry about where the equipment is. You can just kind of move them around. So for example, if I want to get some lighting onto this plant, it could be a real headache to get in some track lighting that's aimed in the right way. Really, I can just grab one of these light fixtures, and what you'll see, they're actually called Brody Studio spots. They are a studio light, but they have a directionality to them. Let me just copy this guy over here. And what you should see pretty quickly is a blob of light on the floor. And of course, it's very easy to aim it. Now, I think in the past, I've said, oh, you have to have several views open at the same time, your plan and your section and blah-de-blah-de-blah-de. The advantage of Enscape is that you can just kind of nudge it around until you get enough light onto the object. Now, be aware that Enscape does not respect family types, so individual families. So if I came in here and I was like, I want that to be a little wider, go to Edit Type, Duplicate, change its name, and then go down and change its distribution. Enscape doesn't like that. I'm not sure why. It's just a quirky thing. Better is to just have an entirely different family. So I have this one. If I come in here and I choose the one that is 40 degrees, I'll get a wider light distribution, and then I'll have the nice blob of light on my object. And you can come in, I believe it's set to kind of the power of the sun here. They're supposed to be pretty bright. Let's see, 1500 lumens is pretty bright. I can change this down to 500 and apply. And you should see the light level drop down significantly. So you can kind of tweak things, and of course you can have more than one light fixture on an object. Enscape will absolutely adjust the overall light level based on everything you have going on in your project. So that's when you'll want to go back to your settings and start fiddling around. But again, the advantage is not that it's doing anything new, it's just making what Revit does go a bit more smoothly. When you do a lot of mucking around with lighting and materials, you might need to relaunch Enscape if there's a problem. So these are general sorts of things. You can also change materials, and you should. And this is for example, if you think of a laminate countertop, not all laminates reflect materials the same. Some actually have a bumpy surface if you put your nose really close to them. Others are smoother. You can use black and white maps for reflections and bumps and transparency. Finally, there is a party trick. So what can you do in Enscape? Well, one thing you can do is copy lighting from the Enscape IES sample file. So this is the IES gallery that I have posted to Canvas, and what you'll see pretty clearly is that there are a lot of light fixtures out there, and they are all kind of using Revit's internal IES file connection. And the light output that you get from these is quite different. More of a cone shape here. This would be more typical of a downlight. This one is a little wider field of distribution. And then here, this one is very much a wall washer. You see how the light is very even from top to bottom, and it really snugs itself right up close to the ceiling. Again, you can open the IES Revit file and copy and paste right into your own personal Revit file. You can change the name or append the name of a material in Revit. You can add grass or short grass or tall grass to the material name, and it will actually become essentially carpet. Really shaggy carpet, but it becomes carpet. But if you do have somewhere where you see actual grass or where you have other planting material, sometimes changing that name can really make a big difference. So Enscape provides a kind of blank model with a lot of strange golf balls in it, all painted different materials. And I'm going to use it to show you how you can update materials in Revit, and they change pretty fast in Enscape. And of course you might say, well, why don't I just use the preview window? Isn't that enough? And actually it is enough in some ways, but the advantage here, some changes that you make in Enscape in Revit will not make a huge difference in Enscape. If I hit apply here, and I might say, geez, patina, that should be a big difference. But I think because we're out in a space here where there's no obvious and clear small object reflections that might make a huge difference, changing the patina amount doesn't actually make a huge difference. One thing that will make a big difference is if you change it to, say, satin. We'll hit apply. And you can see that really immediately takes the effect of a satin finish. Other things that you can do in Revit that you may or may not use occasionally, for example, these procedural patterns, they're called. This is a relief pattern using a knurl. If I hit apply, you might say, nothing happened. Why did nothing happen? And the reason is Enscape does not, unfortunately, respect these procedural patterns. So if you use these a lot, well, then, Enscape is probably not so great for you. But if you want to use a custom image for a relief pattern, and I'll just select one from an image file, and I've got here an image from 3form. Typically, these bump maps and relief patterns and all that, they are going to be black and white. So, or at least have grayscale. So be sure if you have an image file that you use the black and white image. And what you'll see here is this is reflected in the pattern. And now when I hit apply, that will show up just fine. And of course, there are the other modifiers. You can control the amount and apply. Remember that you do have to hit apply. Some changes aren't huge when you apply them, but other changes are. We can also do the same thing for cutouts. Again, when you turn this on, there are these procedural cutout patterns. These will not work, unfortunately. Wouldn't that be cool? But they don't. It just ignores them completely. You'll have to use an image file. So go to Custom. So let's use that same image file and apply it. And what you should see is a bunch of holes in your brass ball here. And of course you can tint it just like you would do in any instance here. Let's give it a nice, I don't know, orange tint, see what happens. Okay, and apply. Obviously the render environment in Enscape is going to be different. It's going to reflect ambient light conditions. The lighting conditions in the preview window are different, and so you'll want to make sure that the material looks the way you want it. Another thing you can do is use a lower render setting in Enscape. I will warn you that those lower settings do change the way the image looks. So you can see here I've got this lovely view. If I go to my Enscape settings and I change the quality of the rendering, right now it's on Ultra, which will probably slow things down a little bit. Although I find the slowest part of everything is launching the Enscape window. Anyway, if I drag it down, you may or may not notice a big difference when you get down to medium. But if you go to draft, you will see the colors really simplify a lot. Now, that may or may not be what you're looking for. So be sure that you preview it in the manner which you are hoping. And another thing you can do is change it to architectural 2-point. If I click on that button now, you can see all the vertical lines are vertical. So I can go up and down, but it will not change the kind of distortion, the 3D distortion. Now, one more fun trick that Enscape can do is it can use what's called a skybox image. And what this is, it's basically a kind of cube-shaped image file that puts your model inside a giant cube with pictures on it. And the advantage of this, it's only slightly pronounced in still images where the exterior of the building appears natural. But for walkthrough images, it's actually really important as you walk by a window that it appear normal. Really the only way to do this is to include a skybox image. So let's take a look at that. So to add an image outside of the window, you go to the Load Skybox from File button here, and it will ask you, what kind of file do you want? They do have to be an HDR file. I've got one here for Lake Garda in northern Italy. Looks really nice. And you load it in, and what you see outside of your window is basically the view out to Lake Garda in Italy. You can also tell it to use the brightest point in the image as the sun direction. What that will do, it will change where the model perceives the sun to be. So you do have to be a little bit careful about that. One thing that you'll see is that you can rotate the image, and we'll find out where the sun is in this image. You see how, oh yes, it's coming up over that lovely road in your image file. And of course you can control how bright it is outside. So if you want it to be brighter or darker outside the window. It will also, if you uncheck normalize brightness, it will basically default to kind of a dark background image. The other thing to notice is that it will take the reflective characteristic of the glass in your view. So if you change how reflective that glass is, you're going to get a lot more reflecting in the windows. And that may or may not be what you want. Sometimes it's a little disturbing. Usually there is a reflection, a kind of mirror effect on the brighter space. So if we wanted this to be perhaps a little more realistic, we could come in here and rotate the image, go back to the Atmosphere tab, and rotate it around so that now we are getting this reflection because perhaps it's brighter on the inside than on the outside. Finally, you do need to actually export this image. A bummer about Enscape is that you can't really easily adjust the cropping of your image. So Enscape will adjust the image that you export to be really the view that you have. So if I make this a much smaller view, really short and wide, that's exactly what I'll get when I export the image. If you want to change the proportions of this window, you are going to have to think about basically how am I going to get the view composition that I want. There is also a map. If you type in M for map, and you can even scroll in and out in the map view if you find that handy dandy, which who wouldn't? Anyway, once you've got the image set to the way that you like it, adjust all the other settings, you can go to the capture menu. So once you have it set to PNG file, which is probably the best file format for us, just type or hold down Shift and tap F11, and it will export the image. Now, what if you want a much larger image file format? Here's where Enscape isn't doing us any favors. If I were to, say, choose 4K, that's going to be as big as we're going to get, but you see how the aspect ratio has now changed, and this is kind of irritating. When you export at this high resolution, you will get a very nice image, but you will not get the exact image that you see. Now, if it's driving you bananas that the custom menu for resolution doesn't allow you to kind of specify an aspect ratio, that really bugs me. Normally, when it takes your window size, you might actually know your window size off the top of your head. I actually had to go and look at the properties of the image to find out the exported image size. Anyway, you can use math to figure out what the custom image size should be. Just use proportions. The biggest you can go is 4096. And when I did the math to get the exact proportion of my original image here, my original image window, I have to use 22 2247, and that gives me an aspect ratio of 1.82, which conveniently is the exact size that I have here in my window. Now, when you hold down Shift F11, you will have a happy result. You will also notice, by the way, that the Enscape settings menu is persistent, which is to say it stands up against all challengers. No, it stands up against whatever background windows you happen to have open. So you can see here I have all of my most recently exported images. Here's the first one that I exported. You can see in the preview here the size of the image, 1890 by 1041. I guess I didn't have my Enscape window in full screen. And then when I exported it again, this is the 4K image. It's a slightly different proportion, 4096 by 2160. I made this one 4096 by 2247. So now that you've captured this image, let's see if we're going to be able to print it as big as we want. Printing really big is a really big problem, actually. And here's my export that we made in the first video. And I used the 4K settings in Enscape, and so it's a pretty nice image size, but is this going to print nice and sharp? Well, actually, no, because we can calculate the image size that we need to get a big print, and basically the number of pixels per inch is the critical number. Our printer tends to look pretty good at 200 pixels per inch. That's our desired printing resolution. And since we want the image to be 36 inches wide, that's how wide the paper is, but actually we want a full bleed and the printer doesn't print all the way up to the margin. So really we're going to go with a 35-inch image. That times 200 pixels per inch is 7,000 pixels. That's a lot of pixels. That's more than our 4K export. Well, how can we get 7,000 pixels? Well, there's a couple ways. The simplest way, which I don't want you to do, but in case you need to do it, this is how you would do it, is you call up good old Revit, forget about Enscape, and just render the window that you see in Revit. And if you call up this image on a desktop, you can change the crop region size and just select the crop region, click on size on the toolbar, and you can change it to any size you want. Then when you render on the desktop, so you're not rendering anywhere, you're not sending it to the cloud, you're just literally clicking render on the computer, it will render, and it will render the full-size image, and you won't have to do anything else. The only problem is that it's going to take days, literally, to do this. So, and of course there's other issues with rendering on the desktop. You need all your materials and that kind of thing. And another possibility is to use the render cloud and kind of trick it to rendering two halves of the single image. So these are the left and the right sides of a rendering that I'd like to do at 7,000 pixels. I can render each half and then glue them back together again in Photoshop. And as long as you render each one with about 4,000 pixels wide, you should be good, because then your added together image will be 8,000 or pretty close anyway, depending on how precisely you cut the image in half. Now, for us, we want to use Enscape, but unfortunately the maximum export dimension is 4096 by 4096. For us, what we're going to do is export our image and then use Photoshop. So here's the image in Photoshop, and we can go to image size to set it to the right dimension. And what you'll see most of the time, most of our exports come out of either Revit or SketchUp or Enscape at a resolution which is of their own making, their own choosing. 72, I guess, is a screen resolution. Anyway, let's make that 200, but the trick here is make sure to have the resample button checked. Now, if I don't check that button and I change this to 200, what you'll see is that it will do the calculation for me. At 200 pixels per inch, I only get 20 inches of a print. Now, what I want is to resample this and get a much larger print. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can change the size of the image for larger prints, and one of them is to preserve the details, one is to make it smoother. I have found better luck with smoother, but it does vary, so my advice is try them both. But let me choose this one, and now when I type in 35 inches, what you'll see is, again, it does the calculation for me. Now I'm up to 7,000 pixels, and it also tells me, whoa, this is going to be a really big file. Now it's 73 megabytes, and that is for a JPEG. Again, when you click OK, it's going to zoom in on it, and you'll see that basically the image is exactly the same, except that now it's much larger. Finally, now that you've got an image that's 7,500 pixels, you're going to want to go to the Mac print station, open the image in Photoshop, and print a test strip. So let's see how to do that. So you may not be able to tell, but I'm actually sitting in the print lab right now. And let's call up the print menu from our pull-down menu here. You can also type Command P, and it will bring up the Photoshop print dialog box where you can change the size of the preview image. You can also tell it which printer you want to use. We're going to be using the Epson large format one, but I happen to have the HP shown here. You can control if it's landscape and portrait. These are all things you probably have done before. But the other thing that you can do is you can change the paper size to be a test strip. And click Save. And what you'll see is a test strip. Oh, I guess I'm in the wrong orientation here. I'm vertical instead of horizontal. Either one works. It actually doesn't matter which direction so much as what you see in the image. Just stretch out your image so you can see colors in your drawing in particular that you're either worried that they're not going to print well. You can zoom in or out. I find that just a kind of swath across the entire image will give you a pretty good sense. Just click Print or Done. Click Print when you're actually ready to go. And when it does print, it will tell you, oh, you know, if you've stretched that image out too far, it'll be too big for the actual printer. And you've printed it out, and we've all looked at it and made comments. What are you going to do to make it print better? This is the whole goal of our project here, is to really come up with a good result, a good finished print result, and the draft is always going to need some adjustment. So, of course, there are the original file that you can return to in Revit and fiddle around with materials and lighting. That's the most common problem. Of course, Enscape also has settings where you can fiddle around with the line work, with the exposure, with some of the other more artsy-fartsy settings. And then within Photoshop, there are plenty of adjustments that you can do. First of all, to change the print quality. So brightness contrast is a great one. These adjustment layers are easy to insert, and they can really affect the print very, very nicely and evenly. You can also select areas and then insert a brightness contrast or other adjustment layer, and it will only apply to that area that you've inserted. So if you have, say, a part of the room where there wasn't a whole lot of light, and so it obviously renders dark, you can try adjusting just that room or just that part of the room using a brightness contrast adjustment layer. There are also the levels, which can help you to add brightness or subtract it from certain areas. Curves is another adjustment layer. And finally, saturation. Now, once you've taken a look at your test strip print, you may decide that some of your colors need to be changed back in Revit or whatever, but also you can use here right in Photoshop some really nice adjustment layers. One of my favorites, the simplest one, is this brightness contrast adjustment layer. What's nice about this layer, here, let me get that menu over here, is that it kind of applies the adjustment globally, and And it's pretty easy. This is a common thing. Your print just comes out a little bit too dark. And so brightness contrast is obviously a really good one. But the other ones that are available in this menu are really great too. One that is particularly fun to play around with is levels. And what this allows you to do is you can kind of click at various points in the curve. The mid-range adjustments are the ones that are going to kind of alter your shadows. And you can see here as I adjust this, I can kind of get rid of some of that darkness in the back of the space just by some subtle adjustments. So that's the levels adjustment layer. And then there's also the hue and saturation adjustment layer. And this one is also one I think I've mentioned before that is kind of nice. You can kind of pull a bit of the color out of the space. And in fact, a very pleasant image is that black and white image. I find that it really helps you talk about the kind of space and the drawing composition without being distracted by all of those materials. But even toning it down just a little bit is a good way to do it. And what's really terrific about these adjustment layers is they are non-destructive. I can just turn them off and I'm back at my original image, or I can turn one or another of them on just to kind of compare the results. Now, don't forget, you can also use the ArchVision people, the ArchVision entourage, which is only available on the desktops. Now, as a note, when you do use that with Photoshop, it remains in the Photoshop document. You don't need to stay on the desktops. And as long as we are on the Photoshop interface, we can take advantage of using the ArchVision library of people that are on the desktops in VPAC 206. And as we've learned, you can rotate these people around, you can download different ones, you can kind of put them in situationally appropriate positions, and click the render button. And that will allow you to have your Photoshop window right nearby, and you can drag them right in. And this is an advantage over, say, using ArchVision RPC people in Revit, which is that in Revit you can't leave the desktop. You can only render right there, otherwise they don't work. Here with Photoshop, that image becomes a part of your Photoshop drawing, and you can manipulate it. You can close the file and open it up somewhere else, and it doesn't go away. Then once everything is all put together, all we want you to do is print the final and print it on the Epson printer at 36 inches.